Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. Just a couple of quick announcements. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so you can go ahead and type them at any time on the control panel on your right, and we will do our very best to answer as many as possible. Also, after the webinar is over, approximately about an hour after, you'll receive a survey, and if you fill out the survey, you'll also receive the slides from today's presentation. So we are so excited. Today's topic is when anxiety is not anxiety, and our presenter is Dr. Katiraei. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you. Thank you, doctor, for being here.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be sharing this information with your audience. Let's see here. There we go. For those who don't know me, I'm a pediatrician that's had pretty extensive training in various areas of integrative medicine. And, really at the end of the day, what it all boils down to is I was one of the children that I am now treating. So I was the child that had such severe anxiety that I didn't want to leave the house. I would go to school and then come running home and basically lock myself up in my room. And that was really the essence of why I did all of this, decade-long training from doing 2 different fellowships. I'm one of a handful of people trained in systems biology and endobiogeny, which looks at how we use plants and various herbs to rebalance the neuroendocrine system. I've done training in MAPS. I'm an osteopath by background, so I understand how structure affects everything. And over the last decade, I've treated literally thousands of children, just like how I used to be, who have severe anxiety, behavioral issues, and a lot of them are ultimately labeled as autism spectrum. And as we know, that label doesn't necessarily tell us why children suffer. I'm in private practice in Santa Monica, and we are working to actually build a website called Holistic Minds, which leverages artificial intelligence to actually extend the care that I have been doing in the clinic to families around the world to help them get access to care and ultimately for them to understand why their child is suffering. I have no financial relationships with Neurons, even though Neurons is represented here. So I don't get a dime or a dollar from any purchases that are made. I'm here just to really share good information that will hopefully help a lot of families and ultimately a lot of the children in those families. As an osteopath, this was a quote that I was taught early on, which is when there's an issue with health, there's a reason for it, and that reason has a location. And it is the job of us as physicians to really understand what it is that is blocking the health of that child, and then use the right tools to remove it. So for our families out there, I really want them to kind of step back and ask the question, of these different things, which could not be a cause of ADHD, anxiety, and depression? And ultimately, these are, various manifestations that children on the spectrum especially have. And what may be shocking to some is that actually all of these can cause these various manifestations and may ultimately be one of the underlying root causes of why your child may be suffering. I've seen mold, I've seen tongue ties, I've seen metabolic issues. There's a lot of kids that have thyroid and adrenal imbalances. And part of what I do is really look at all of these pieces and more in a holistic fashion and see how they come together to impact a child's functioning. Now, today our goal is not to get into every single one of these nuances, but it's really to focus on the metabolic issues. And the reason why we're going to focus on the metabolic issues is because I believe that they're one of the foundational pieces of a human being's functioning, especially a child who has suffered from various kinds of behavioral manifestations. Let's talk about sensory processing disorder, because ultimately this is something that is probably very either already well known to some people, and for some who don't know it, they should know it because it is probably impacting their child and their ability to function in the world. So children who have sensory processing disorders are constantly fidgeting. They're the kids that can't sit for 2 seconds. They're at the dinner table and they have to get up every 15 seconds to move their bodies. They're distracted. They lose focus. They are overwhelmed. And this is something that really breaks my heart, because I know what these kids go through, because I still have some degree of sensory processing disorder, even though I've done a lot to address it. But these kids get overwhelmed in the world, and literally at the end of the day, life's experiences are just too much for these kids. And when you look at especially the children that are, the children who have full-blown autism, they're just overwhelmed by life. Every single little thing in life causes them to get stressed out, and ultimately causes them to be unable to be in the world because of that overwhelm. And these things show up in different ways. Some kids are just quote unquote clumsy. They could be picky eaters. They could get overwhelmed, as we talked about. They hate tags on their clothing. They don't like to wear clothing. Socks have to be a certain way. Certain things are too loud, too bright. And all of these really boil down to, these are processing issues in how we process our senses. And a lot of times families don't totally understand this, and we think, oh, well, some kids are just trying to be a pain in the butt, or yeah, they're just being difficult, or oh, he's just picky, or oh, she's just clumsy. There's a reason why these things happen. There's a reason why children can't function. There's a reason why your child may be suffering in the world, and why they may be struggling to be in the world. And this is really why I'm here. This is really why I want to share the information, because I have come to a place where I realize the vast majority of things that we see in children, the vast majority of reasons why children suffer and can't function optimally, have reasons. And if we can understand what those reasons are, then we can do something about it to really alleviate the suffering and poor functionality of a child. The way these authors, and this is a really well put together website, SPD Star, talks about sensory processing as basically a way the nervous system receives information from the senses, and ultimately how it's able to organize that information to make sense of it. And when there's an issue with that way of organizing the information, then you get this sensory processing disorder. This is the way I look at it. I like to simplify things. Too much complexity ultimately doesn't serve anyone. So ultimately, the way I see sensory processing disorder is our brain's ability to process information from the world around us is simply messed up. The wires are, short circuiting, and the information doesn't get to where it needs to. So ultimately, there is a problem with that. And that is what causes the suffering of a lot of these children, and why some of the members of our audience listening may see their own child suffering. When we look at the information on ADHD, we find that about 64% of children with ADHD have a sensory processing disorder. And part of what I have found is that, at least in my experience, 50% of the kids that come in for consultation for ADHD actually don't have ADHD in the classical sense of, oh, his brain chemistry is off. It's literally these children who act ADD, ADHD, their brains, their circuits are crossed. So the way they process information is actually not efficient, and that causes them to be distractible and hyperactive and constantly moving. What's really amazing is that it isn't just focus and concentration that gets impacted. These children's ability to socialize, the way they process information visually, so a child's ability to read, for instance, could be off. The child's ability to play certain sports. Like, I, for the life of me, couldn't and still can't play football, tennis, any of those things, because my hand-eye coordination is just awful. But certain kids have issues where when they try to read, either they can't read, so they may be extremely smart, they may have a really high IQ, but when it comes to a select area of functioning, such as reading, they're suddenly like 2 or 3 grade levels below. And there's a reason for that. It may be that the child's ability to process information through their eyes is inefficient. And the really cool thing is there are developmental optometrists that can actually address this. And I've seen kids that were literally at the bottom of their class when it came to reading, and then suddenly after 6 months of therapy, they're at the top of their class and they're reading 300-page books, whereas a year ago they could barely read. And that's really a testament to what children are capable of and what the human body is capable of when you remove the restriction and you allow the health to come back. And that's part of what we're talking about here. So there's so many reasons why children can suffer. And the part that's really staggering is that children on the spectrum have pretty much all of them, 95% of them, according to this study, have sensory processing disorders. So for families that don't know about sensory processing disorders, they should know about this and they should be doing research on this because this may be significantly impacting their child's ability to function in the world. Now, what ultimately causes a child to be able to process information through their senses? Like, where does this organization come from? Because yes, you could work with an occupational therapist, you could work with a vision therapist, you could do all of those things. But first, before we get there, we need to ask, why do these issues happen in the first place? And when we understand that, one, we're able to do things to prevent them. And two, we can even become more effective at addressing them. And to really understand that, I would highly recommend for families to read this article. It's widely available on the internet and it's by Jane Williams. And this brilliant gal from Australia wrote this, I call it kind of a paramount article that really breaks down why these things happen. And part of what she says is that the foundation of complex human thought and behaviors have their origins in action. So movement is ultimately necessary for cognitive development, and it lays down the foundation for future levels of brain development. This is really critical for people to understand. What she goes on to say is that babies who crawl into their tummies, they creep on their hands and knees, are stimulating thousands of neural pathways, which ultimately give the child an automatic sense of body position and self-control. And when you think about children with ADHD, autism, what do they lack? They lack a sense of body position. They're constantly bumping into things, crashing into things. They can't control their bodies. They're constantly moving and getting up. And that is because those neural pathways, those connections were never formed in the first place. And what she goes on to say is ultimately all of the movements from pushing up to rolling and crawling develop a strong foundation and development for sensory skills such as vision, which has to do with reading, and proprioception, which is ultimately our body's location in space and time. So these kids that can't sit still, they're at the dinner table and every 2 seconds they have to get up and move their bodies. They're activating inappropriately their proprioceptive skills, their vestibular systems, because through moving, this weird movements that they do, that is actually how they feel normal. So they're not trying to be a pain in the butt, they're just trying to feel normal. And that is part of what we can give them if we understand why they're suffering. The process of crawling, and this is really key for me as a pediatrician, when I'm taking care of our well kids, I obsess with crawling. Like we do anything and everything necessary to make sure a child crawls because it is key for hand-eye coordination, vestibular processing, movement, improvement in balance and equilibrium, spatial awareness. And I, as a human being, have these issues because I was a child who didn't crawl. And 40 years ago, my parents didn't. I mean, no one knew that crawling was so key. So they were like, oh, he hasn't crawled. And then at a year and change, I started walking. So I actually missed all of these things that were paramount for my long-term functioning. I've learned ways to ultimately address these now as an adult. I've learned ways to connect my system, but it also caused 20, 30 years of suffering in many ways because these pieces were not in place. Ultimately, our visual spatial ability doesn't just impact our ability to learn. It impacts our spatial memory, our ability to form mental images, our distance and depth perception. So the clumsy child that constantly bumps into things, and some of you parents listening, you may be the person who constantly gets bruises and you don't know why. Well, the reason why you're getting bruised and you don't know why is because your brain probably does not know where you are in space. So you're constantly bumping into furniture and things and don't even realize it because your depth perception, your distance perception may also be off. And ultimately, all of these things impact our mental representation of three-dimensional space. Now, why is that important? Well, if you don't know where your body is in space, how can you ever feel secure in where you are? And this is really important because I can't tell you how many kids I've seen, how many kids I've worked with where they presented with anxiety, ADHD, well, fill in the blank, autism spectrum. And ultimately, when we addressed these fundamental elements of their neural functioning, suddenly ADHD, anxiety, and autism were gone. Why? Because the child finally knew where their body, where they were in space and time. And that is paramount, that is critical, that is foundational to a child feeling secure in the world. These kids are literally lost in space. And if you're lost in space, how can you expect the child to function? How can you expect them to thrive or feel confident or comfortable even? And it goes beyond this, that ultimately these children will have not only behavioral issues, but also a lot of different academic issues. And ultimately, these all come down to these primitive reflexes that they have. And a lot of the OTs, the occupational therapists, work in terms of reintegrating these things and ultimately helping these pathways form in an appropriate fashion. So ultimately, all of these crazy things that kids do, from crashing into the floor and the jumping and the swinging and the rolling and the crawling, these are fantastic things. These are critical things that we need them to do to be able to function well in life. Now, why do I know this and why am I so sensitive to this? It wasn't actually my own story. It's actually this little girl. Her name is Lana. This is my 3-year-old daughter who actually helped me make a lot of these connections. So Lana was as a baby, and the little one next to her is actually a now 4-month-old little baby named Lev. But Lana, when she was younger, and from a few months of age, I noticed that she really lacked tone. So when I would hold her up, she would ultimately be the floppy baby. And I'm sure some of you out there listening can relate to this. You know, she was the floppy baby that didn't have good tone. When she was 6 months old, she still couldn't do tummy time, and she ultimately wasn't rolling over. When she was 11 months old, this little girl was dragging herself on the floor, but literally couldn't get on her hands and knees. So she couldn't get into that quadruped position. And by then, you know, I was like, oh my God, the same thing that happened to me is happening to my daughter. And she's going to end up with a sensory processing disorder. She's going to be suffering and she's going to be struggling in life. And we need to do something about it. We got the regional center on board. We had her in private OT, private PTM. It was a circus show. Like if you could only imagine what we were doing, it was ridiculous. We had so many people working with her, and ultimately nothing was clicking into place. And I got so desperate that I actually built this contraption where part of what was supposed to be done was that she was supposed to be hanging off of this, so I would actually lift up her trunk and body so she can crawl. And ultimately, this little invention was a failure because it ultimately broke. But I got really, really worried because I was worried that my daughter's neural integration was not going to happen. And this is where ultimately a light bulb went off, because I've worked with so many children that are on the spectrum, and in terms of addressing various types of concerns, I ultimately have a lot of training. Now, I've addressed 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. I've never addressed young infants, and I've never used my tools to treat these things that early on. But it really had me ask the question, why does my daughter have such low tone? And ultimately, a light bulb went off. I'm like, oh my God, she has a metabolic condition. She has an issue with how effectively she can produce energy. And I've come to believe that this is actually genetic, because our 4-month-old has the strength of an ox, and he is so absurdly strong that it's crazy. And you know, if anything, we were less careful about, you know, my wife's diet when she was pregnant and so forth. And it's not to say environmental factors don't play a part. They absolutely do. But there's also a lot of genetics at play that we call normal, that we probably don't realize there's actually a spectrum of normal or not. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. So as a pediatrician, I was taught to look for the catastrophic metabolic issues. So the conditions that would kill children in the first few months or years of life, that's what we were taught to look for. Except it turns out, and Lana and the hundreds, if not thousands of children that I've worked with just like her, really had me realize that, you know what, there's actually a spectrum. There's a spectrum, and we're missing the fact that there's a spectrum. You have the super athletes on one hand who are absurdly strong, and they can fly through the air and they can run in an absurd way that most other human beings can't. And then there's this guy, the puny guy who can't build muscle for the life of him. His energy production is different, and I am that guy. I have to work out twice as hard as anyone else to produce the same amount of muscle mass. My energy level is not the same as others, at least at a muscular level. And this just really boils down to the fact that genetically there's a spectrum of efficiency in terms of how well we can produce energy. And it turns out if you happen to be on the lower side, which pediatricians call normal, because my daughter would not be considered by a general pediatrician to have any kind of metabolic issue because she's normal. She's doing fine. Everything is fine. Oh, well, she didn't crawl. What's the big deal? But when you look at it from the standpoint of what Dr. Williams talks about, that low tone, quote unquote, normal is actually one of the fundamental pieces, I believe, that then creates a setup for sensory processing issues to occur. Because people like my daughter, people like your child probably, for those of you listening, they just lack the strength, they lack the tone to be able to get on their tummies. They're unable to do the push-ups. They're unable to do the quadruped position. They struggle to get into a crawling position because it actually takes a lot of strength. And what do ultimately 50% of children with sensory processing disorders and autism have? Low muscle tone. If you've worked with an OT, if you have a child who's older, I'm sure you've heard from them, yeah, your child's tone is low. They lack core strength, blah, 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 blah. There's a reason for this. And if you go back in time, you'll see that the same thing that is now showing up in your 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old was there as when they were an infant. It just now looks different, but it's really not. So these things of, oh, he's just lazy. Oh, she likes to sit and play quietly by herself. He's clumsy, not athletic. These are not accidental sayings. There's a reason for this. And this is all having to do with the mitochondria, with how we can produce energy, with the efficiency in which we can produce energy to power our muscles. And when you look at the muscles need electricity in a way to contract. To generate force, to create the contractions, to the bicep curls or the movement of the muscles, all of that takes electricity, and that electricity has to be produced through the foods we eat to break it down. Now, I want to give you an example, and we'll talk on that a little bit further in just a little bit. Jonah was a 12-year-old that I saw. He wasn't on, at least labeled as autistic spectrum. I'm sure, with the right psychologist, he probably would have been because he actually presented with many of the features. But ultimately, the diagnoses of anxiety, depression, and ADHD were given to him. He was on antidepressants, and ultimately, it wasn't working for him. And he continued to have issues with feeling anxious, having poor focus. He really was not a very active guy, so he hated PT or PE and ultimately didn't do much activity. He had very few friends, and ultimately, what he would say is, I just hate school. I can't stand being in school. School drives me crazy. It's so stressful. Summers were fantastic for him because he didn't have to be in school. And when we tested him, what we found is a significant error in fatty acid oxidation. Now, what is fatty acid oxidation? Fatty acid oxidation is basically an error in how we take food. And in the case of Jonah, it was fats. But your child may have issues with protein or carbohydrates, and any of these pathways can be affected. Now, when we eat, so when you take the bite of the sandwich, when you eat the piece of chicken and broccoli, whatever the case is, your body processes these foods into three things: fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Ultimately, all of these pieces have to be broken down to create this acetyl-CoA, and that acetyl-CoA then gets dumped into the citric acid cycle, and through all of these fancy enzymatic processes, you end up with ATP. ATP is the electrical current with which our body functions. Without it, we die. Except what we used to think is that only the people that die had issues with producing enough ATP, and that's actually incorrect. It turns out that some people can produce ATP very efficiently, and those are the super athletes. And then there are some people who don't produce it very efficiently. So they can eat the same amounts, but ultimately how much energy they get from their food is different. And I am one of the people, my daughter is one of them, your child is probably one of the people who just don't produce it as efficiently. What is really amazing, and this is what I want everyone to really understand, what is really amazing in today's time is that we can actually change this. So by using carnitine, by using B vitamins, by using magnesium, by using a host of different amino acids, by using CoQ10, we actually can optimize these processes and bring the inefficient human being like myself, my daughter, and your child to have them essentially become as efficient as almost the super athlete. And it's crazy to see what happens with my daughter when we supplement her. The little girl who was weak and lacking efficiency is now the little girl who's climbing our couch and jumping off the couch to the point where we're like, oh my God, she's going to hurt herself. But she feels so strong and she feels so secure in her body. And that's really what this becomes about. When the child lacks muscle tone, when they lack muscle strength, they actually are not efficient in producing the energy to give them the strength they need to feel secure. When the muscles are strong, when the muscles have tone, what happens is the child feels so secure in their body because now they have the strength to catch themselves when they fall. They have the strength to jump and land securely rather than jump and crash. And that is ultimately what creates a scenario where a child can engage themselves and their body in various movements and activity that causes all of these pathways to get activated, which can actually then resolve the sensory issues. And if your child is in occupational therapy, when they have the strength to do the occupational therapy, and I've seen this 100 times, where kids that were in occupational therapy for 2 years, they got nowhere. I addressed their metabolic issues, and then the OT tells the parents, like, I don't know what the heck you've done, but in 2 months, your kid has made more progress in our OT than what they made in the last 2 years. That has to do with their metabolic efficiency. Why I love Neuroneeds, and again, I don't get a single dollar for doing this talk for them. Why I love Neuroneeds is of all of the products that I've tested, and I've tried just about every single product on the market, it is literally the most perfect metabolic cocktail, the most perfect metabolic supporting vitamin that's out there. And it happens to also taste good, so most kids actually don't mind taking it. So Neuroneeds can address all of these different pieces and in one shotgun approach in a safe fashion. So even if your kid doesn't need it, there's no harm in taking it, but in a safe fashion can actually optimize the energy production to ultimately allow your child to function well. So ultimately, we take the child that's lazy and get them moving and ultimately get kids to be in a place where they can engage their different pathways to allow that sensory integration and connections to take place. But there's more to this picture than that, because it isn't just a conversation about the muscle. This is also a conversation about the brain itself, because it happens that the brain is probably one of the most energy hungry organs in the system. And I'm sure you've all heard this. And to understand how significant this conversation is, we can look at studies that look at people who have metabolic conditions. So people with actual mitochondrial disease. So these are the diagnosable by even medical standards people. And you see in these individuals, they have a huge amount of psychiatric, full-blown psychiatric disease, from major depression to social anxiety disorder. When you look at these, you're like, God, that actually sounds a lot like what a lot of the children on the spectrum have. Well, there's a reason for that, and that has to do with the fact that the mitochondria are essential for brain cellular functioning. Ultimately, everything the brain cells, the neurons do, from the ion ingredients to the neurotransmission, even the receptors, are all energy-dependent processes. When there's not enough ATP, the neurons simply cannot work well. That just goes without saying. And for those of you that really want, go look at this article, and in painful detail, it actually talks about this. Part of what's so fascinating is that, and this is part of what we take for granted, the synaptic vesicles, so ultimately our neurons are connected with other neurons through these things that are called synapses. They're basically neuron to neuron connections. The communication that happens from a neuron to another neuron, from one brain cell to another, is highly metabolically demanding. Ultimately, if there's not enough ATP, you get this thing called synaptic fatigue, which is basically the brain cells are too tired to talk to one another. Literally, they're too tired to talk to one another, and that has to do with ATP. When the neurons can't talk to one another, you end up getting a very weird, disorganized state within the brain. Look at what autism is. Look at what ADHD is. It's a disorganized state within the nervous system. And part of what's amazing about NeuroNeeds is it actually can address this. The part that gets even more interesting is ultimately a lot of the information that is processed by the brain from the outside world is done in the prefrontal cortex. We have these cells called GABAergic neurons. So these are basically the braking system within the brain. So these GABAergic interneurons, and the reason why they call them interneurons is they actually sit in between the other neurons, and they can control the amount of information that comes in. And they prevent this incoming excitation from getting out of control. Well, what's so fascinating is these GABAergic neurons are highly active in the prefrontal cortex. So prefrontal cortex is where we process information from the world around us. And the GABAergic neurons, the interneurons, are potent regulators of the circuits within the prefrontal cortex. And ultimately, they can dampen the information that gets to be too distracting. So the kids that have sensory processing issues, the kids that have ADHD, the kids that get overwhelmed in the world, what they lack is the braking system in the prefrontal cortex to shut down excess information from coming in. That's why these kids get overwhelmed by too much sight and too much sound. Obviously, there's more to this than just this, but this is one piece of that puzzle. What do these interneurons need? Energy. They need a lot of energy because what they're doing actually is really hard work. So the braking system of the brain, the GABAergic neurons in the prefrontal cortex are highly, 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 highly dependent on mitochondrial functioning. And if mitochondrial functioning is not there, you ultimately get an impairment in complex information processing, which can show up as autism spectrum, ADHD, social anxiety, whatever your child has been labeled with, can ultimately be tied and boiled down to this piece. And you can have sociability issues, and sensory gating is basically where children cannot shut off the sensory information that's coming in. But it even goes beyond that. So if your child has a metabolic issue, yes, their muscle tone can be affected, which ultimately causes them to not move their bodies. And if they're not moving their bodies, they're not activating all of these different pathways within the brain to integrate information. If they lack information, they can have an ineffective braking system within the brain. But there's even more to this than that. If that wasn't enough of a mess, it turns out that the adrenal glands are another organ that is highly energy dependent. And ultimately, when you look at it, the poor adrenal glands have to take cholesterol, which we get from food. They have to take it from the outside of the adrenal glands and pump it all the way inside. And then they have to use enzymes to take cholesterol and then turn it to aldosterone, turn it to cortisol, turn it into testosterone. And we take these things for granted. We just think these things happen with no effort. And that is actually completely wrong. The adrenal gland function, the brain functioning, the muscle functioning, all of these are hard work, and hard work requires a lot of energy. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, it turns out that at least 30% of the kids that I work with that are on the spectrum, or kids that might as well be on the spectrum but aren't given that label, have an issue with their adrenal glands. And it turns out that when you have an issue with your adrenal glands, you get this weird excitation. And a lot of you have heard this term in the adult language, tired but wired. Well, there's a reason for that. Tired but wired. So what does it mean to be tired? Well, for a lot of people, and it may be you, people, audience members that are listening, it may be true for your child. First thing in the morning when we wake up, we need cortisol. Cortisol is what causes the nervous system to calm down. So when there's an issue with too little cortisol, the brain actually uses the fight-flight nervous system to push the adrenal glands to produce more activity. So the nervous system is almost the accelerator for the adrenal glands. And when the adrenal glands are working well, so imagine a Ferrari where you basically could touch the accelerator with your little toe and you're going 100 miles an hour, so you dare not even push the accelerator too far. And then you can have a car like mine that, a beat up old Prius that's almost 10 years old, and you have to basically push the gas all the way down to get the engine going to the point where you can get to 65 miles an hour on the freeway. When the adrenal glands don't work well, you have to floor the accelerator to get the adrenal glands to pump out the cortisol and hormones you need. That accelerator is the nervous system. And that is why you get this thing called tired but wired. And there's a very specific pattern. And I'm sure for many of you listening, either you're like, oh my God, I have this. And I have parents tell me this all the time. Or you'll see this in the child. They're crabby in the mornings, even though they've gotten good sleep. By 2 to 4 o'clock, they crash and they get sleepy. Some kids take naps, some kids just get crabby. And then at around 6, 7 o'clock, suddenly they're wide awake. And now come 10 o'clock at night, you have a hard time winding them down. If you see this pattern, this is because your child's adrenal glands are also struggling. So your child may have a triple whammy. They've got the muscle issues, so they can't use their body effectively to integrate their brain. They've got the brain breaking issues, and they've got an adrenal gland problem on top of that. And this combination is enough to drive any human being bonkers, and your poor child may be suffering because of all of this. So at the end of the day, the metabolic errors can influence everything. Every organ can be impacted. I just touched on a few. And a lot of people are obsessed with, well, let's do testing, let's do the diagnosis. And the reality is the perfect test just simply does not exist. It's just not out there. You could do, hospital testing through Quest or LabCorp, but good luck actually trying to interpret those test results. I used to try to do that and I gave up because the test results and the reference ranges are completely off. Using Genova Diagnostics or Great Plains is fantastic. They're not the most sensitive of all tests. Sometimes they detect irregularities as I showed in Jonah. Sometimes they don't. It's great because they do show bacterial, fungal, and other irregularities, so they're helpful in that result. But to look at the electron transport chain and the mitochondria, you either have to do a muscle biopsy, and I would imagine no parent would ever want to do that to their child. There's a test called MitoSwab, and some of you may have actually used that, and it's fantastic. It is quite pricey, but it does give some information, but only checks the electron transport chain. What I like to do is just test. For $80, you can actually treat your child for 1 to 2 months, and one of two things will happen. Either in 2 weeks, you're just like, oh my God, my child is transformed, and I see this all the time. And if your child is transformed and they're doing so much better, who cares what a test would show? Ultimately, by doing this, obviously, we can miss issues like gut imbalances and other things. In 5 to 10% of children, you can get an increase in anxiety because of COMT mutations or other things, because these children, if you push their systems too fast, too hard, they can actually end up with side effects. And if that's the case, you just go much slower. So instead of giving them a full dose, you give them a quarter dose and then slowly build up to a half dose. And then you just find that balance where the child suddenly is doing much better. Some children do need more carnitine because of the fatty acid oxidation. So in some children, I will use Neuronides along with additional carnitine. But at the end of the day, I've gotten to a point where, for me, I just jump into treatment. And I've tried so many products that are out there. And it's not to say those other products are bad. I still think very highly of them, but I've just become pretty obsessed with Neuronides because over and over and over again in treating hundreds of children with Neuronides, I've just seen these remarkable results. And it's what I use for myself. It's actually a supplement that I take a few times a week. It's what I give to my daughter, and I've seen the results in her. And at the end of the day, I think that it's something that's worth at least exploring and entertaining because of the fact that you can see so much benefit. If your child is in occupational therapy, by adding something like NeuroNeeds to the regimen, you may get so much more bang for your buck, and what your child can do in 1 month may be the equivalent of what they were able to do in 6 months. For those of you who want to do things individually, so for some families, they don't want to just do a shotgun approach. This is an amazing regimen that Dr. Rosenthal and Fry came up with, where it actually gives individual dosing. So some families like to just start with CoQ10, and that's fantastic. You can start with carnitine or creatine as individual supplements. Ultimately, for myself, over time, I found that supplements work best when used in synergy. So by addressing multiple parts of the pathway that I showed you in that entire citric acid cycle, by addressing everything at one time, you ultimately may get better results. So part of really what we need to do is look at the body as a whole and not just look at one part, because that's part of what we tend to do, even in some of our holistic medicine circles. You know, we focus on just the gut or focus on just the thing. And that's not how the human body functions. In reality, when I see children, I find that they have multiple issues in multiple domains. And part of my job is to identify all of those issues and then understand how to treat them in a specific fashion for that child. So part of why I've gone through the metabolic disorders is because I find the metabolic disorders to be foundational, and they're actually much more common than we realize. And when you address the metabolic issues, ultimately you can address adrenal imbalances and muscle issues and various other things. But it's not to say that the metabolic issues are it. And part of what we ultimately need to do is really look at a child holistically. And this diagram is my depiction of how everything is ultimately connected to everything. And yes, we address energy because energy impacts everything. And for me, NeuroNeeds is by far the best way to do that. But we also look at, you know, does the child have structural issues? And do they need osteopathic or craniosacral care? Do they have gut issues? Do they have an immune imbalance? Do they have hormone imbalances? And part of what we do with Holistic Minds, part of the system that we're working to build out, and I encourage you to visit our website at holisticminds.com, part of what we're doing is looking at children in a holistic fashion to understand what we can do to help them regain their vibrancy and health. And with that, I thank you for listening. This is Dr. K.
Perfect. Thank you so much for doing the presentation. We have a couple of questions, and if anyone wants to type in their questions now on that control panel, you can go ahead. One person is asking, is it okay to give multiple supplements together? Are there any rules of supplements on which ones you shouldn't mix? And if so, like, where can I find that?
So, you know, generally speaking, I think it's absolutely fine to combine supplements. The only caveat is for, especially for families whose children have ADHD and are on the spectrum, to be careful of pushing the B vitamins. So a lot of times I'll see families come in and their child is getting methylfolate and methyl B12, and then they're on a mitochondrial that also has B vitamins in it, and they're getting a B complex on top of that. You give these children too many of the B vitamins in particular, you're asking for trouble to happen. So, you know, this notion that a little bit is good, more is great is actually false. It's really looking at how do you use things in synergy to help children. And part of where I really caution families is don't push the B vitamins too high, because at some point you're probably going to get an anxiety-like manifestation because you've just pushed the child system beyond it. For most of these other supplements, because pretty much all vitamins are water soluble, children just pee it out if they don't need it. You do want to be careful with fat soluble vitamins like vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin E, because you can technically cause an overdose if you use high doses long enough. But generally speaking, these supplements are really safe, and that's part of why, I feel very comfortable in saying, for families to just try Neuronids and see if they see a benefit, because you can't really do any kind of harm as long as you don't push it past the child's tolerance.
Perfect. The next question, does dosing for mito change through adolescence?
Uh, yes, ultimately it's just really based on body volume, if you want to say, or body mass. So as someone gets older, they need a higher amount of the vitamins just to address their metabolic needs. So yes. And Neuronids, if you look on their website, they actually have dosing for young children, adolescents, and teenagers, and then adults. And it's basically half a scoop to 1 scoop versus 2 scoops versus 3 scoops.
Perfect. The next question is about my child has low iron. Do you have any suggestions about how to give him iron?
So you can use things like vitamin C. So vitamin C can help increase iron absorption. A lot of times when I see iron deficiency, that actually becomes a red flag for me that there's probably some kind of gut issue. So some of the kids that I see that have had long-standing iron deficiency, they have parasites in their gut, they have various kinds of food intolerances that have been missed, and basically these poor children have microscopic amounts of bleeding in their gut. So you're pumping them full of iron and you're getting their iron stores up, but then that iron is just getting leached out of the gut because of the gut irritation. So one of the things that's really, really important is to make sure that your child's gut is healthy and whole before you start really aggressively supplementing. And then when you address that, and then you do something like iron and vitamin C, and there are various combinations out there that have that, that usually takes care of it. And within a few months, the iron should come up nicely.
Perfect. The next question is, a lot of people are saying that they have like older kids, like 17 plus, and do you think it's too late to help them, or have any suggestions on how to start their treatment?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think I was 35 when I started my treatment. It's finally when I realized, like, oh my God, I have all of these issues. So absolutely not. It's never too late to start. And, a 17-year-old may not necessarily want to go into occupational therapy, but by addressing their metabolic issues, their mitochondrial issues alone, that can significantly improve their quality of life. And I brought up Jonah. I mean, he was already a teenager when I started working with him, as a case where it's never too late. You may just adapt things, and instead of doing the same OT that you would do for the 5-year-old, you may do some kind of other way to integrate the system. But no, it's never too late.
Perfect. The next question is, what do you recommend for gut repair? I think my child has gut issues.
Oh, I wish there was one magical answer for that. The first thing is identifying the cause of the gut issues. So whether it's a food issue, and I recommend, for the family to find either a well qualified nutritionist that's capable of working with them, or a functional medicine doctor, or a MAPS doctor, because most MAPS doctors are more than qualified to help with them. But first, identifying what is causing the gut issue in the first place. Is it a parasite? Is it fungus? Is it bacteria? Do they have food intolerances? In addressing those pieces, having a good quality probiotic, and there's a lot of them out there. Claire Labs has several great probiotics. We use one from Orthomolecular called Orthobiotic, and I have no relationships with any of these companies. Any of those could be helpful. But I wish it was as simple as, give this one supplement and everything will get better. There L-glutamine and combinations, like there's a product by Designs for Health called GI Revive that has L-glutamine, aloe, cat's claw, various other things. All of those are fantastic, and all of these will help once you figure out what is causing the issue in the first place.
Perfect. And then last couple questions I'm going to bunch together is about people are saying that they see a regular pediatrician and they want advice on how to speak to the regular pediatrician, or do you suggest going to see a holistic doctor, a MAPS doctor right away?
That depends on the pediatrician. There are some pediatricians who are surprisingly open-minded, and for them it's like, well, I don't understand this. This stuff is completely weird to me, but I want to support you, and sure, you do what you need, and I'll support you along the way. Other pediatricians are very closed off, and they're of the mindset of, I was trained in this. Why are you telling me about my own field? How dare you question what it is that I've told you? And if the pediatrician's of that mindset, that's when you definitely need to find someone. I think part of the question also becomes, how much digging do you have to do? I think, giving something like neuro needs as a treatment and as a almost a diagnostic tool, you don't really need that much supervision. I think talking to your pediatrician and making sure they're on board, so if anything, like your child gets a little hyper, or at least you've got someone watching over them, isn't a bad idea. But with something like neuro needs, that the you would have to basically give them almost the entire canister at one time to cause any kind of overdose, and no parent in the right mind would do that. But if you want to do urine organic acid testing or do gut testing, these are things that most general pediatricians are just not trained to be able to decipher. And that's when you'd want to talk to a functional medicine doctor or a MAPS doctor, because this is where they're trained in. They've had years and years of training and experience to be able to use these tools to really help you understand what is ailing your child and ultimately how to help them.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And then again, if you fill out the survey that you'll receive in about an hour, you will get the slides from today's presentation. And I want to say thank you so much, Dr. K, for being here and giving us all of this important information.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.